afternoon, everybody. It is a bit daunting to speak in such a forum where very scholarly people have spoken before. If nothing, um, one source of inspiration is the fact that my Adi Guru for Sanskrit is present here. The person who taught me at school, Suresh sir, is here, and that makes it most gratifying, and it makes the whole effort worth it. I'm grateful for his presence here, and any little that I know in the literature and the linguistics of Sanskrit is all from the arms that he gave me. I start by saluting my teacher. I had originally titled the talk, The Bird and the Word. And then Professor Kannan told me it will be very abstract, you have to give an explanation. So the expanded title, but I will still go with that title. The title of the talk is The Bird and the Word. And you may all know that the bird over there refers either to the Shiena or Suparna or Garutman or Garuda, and the word there refers to the Gayatri Chandas. And since I have no scholarliness in that area, I am not talking about the Veda. I am not talking about the Vedangas or the Upangas. What I am going to talk about is a story. And not just one story, but 6 stories. And all these 6 are the same stories which have accumulated over years in various layers. And time permitting, I will tell you bits of all those stories. And some of them will be familiar, some may be unfamiliar. The story that I am going to tell you is that of the Somaharana, the story of the collection of the Somalata. And there are several stages to the story. The oldest is that mentioned in the Rig Veda. The next stage of this story is that which comes in the Samhita and the Aranyakas associated with the Yajurveda. The next stage of the story is that seen in the somewhat apocryphal Suparnakhyana and in the Mahabharata. And the next stage of the story is the version seen in the Ramayana. And the later stages are what we see in the Puranas, which I have not looked at in great detail. So let us start looking at the story. In the Rig Veda, in the 4th mandala, we have the story of how either Vamadeva or Indra decided that he wanted the Soma and therefore took the form of a vulture or a winged bird described as Shiena. And this Shiena went up in the air, went up to the sky, got back the Soma, and what did it do with the Soma? It gave the Soma to Manu. Manu performed a yajna, offered the Soma Havis to Indra, and Indra was able to attain Devatva. And in the course of the story, there was a protector of the Soma. And the protector of that Soma was a Gandharva. The Gandharva's name was Krishna. This is the first stage of our story. The second stage of our story, which we see in the later texts like the Taittiriya Samhita, the Taittiriya Brahmana, the Shatapatha Brahmana, the Kathaka Samhita, and so on, is a slight variation of the story. In this story, we already see a competition between the 2 wives of Kashyapa, though they are not mentioned by that name here. We know them as Kadru and Suparni. Explicitly, a relationship is marked between Kadru and the earth, Suparni and the sky. So these 2 goddesses or Rishipatnis had a competition, and as a consequence of that competition, they decided that we will get Soma from the Tripath heaven, the 3-layered heaven. What happened? They decided to send Suparni's children. Who were Suparni's children? It is quite unusual. We see in the Kathaka Samhita that the first child that went was the Jagati meter, the Jagati Chandas. And the Jagati Chandas at that time apparently had 14 letters to a foot. And when Jagati went and tried to capture the Somalata, the same Gandharva, Krishanu, whom we saw in the Rig Veda, shot at her or him. And a foot fell off, 2 aksharas fell off. And Jagati came back unsuccessful. The next to go was the Trishtup meter, who is also a child of Suparni. And the Trishtup meter has 13 aksharas. And that too was shot at by this archer who probably would have won an Olympic in these days, Krishanu. And 2 letters fell off from Trishtup as well. And who went next? The youngest child, who was our hero, or rather our heroine. The Gayatri Chandas, which was the smallest Chandas with 8 aksharas. And the Gayatri not just managed to go there, bring back the Somalata, but was very resourceful. Those 2 letters which had fallen off from Jagati and those 2 letters which had fallen off from Trishtup, Gayatri also picked up those 4 letters extra and came back with 12 letters. And all the sages praised this Gayatri, who despite being the youngest, was able to be so resourceful and come back. As a result, the Gayatra or the Gayatri is used for hymns of praise. We also notice another interesting matter in this stage of the story, which is that not just is there a Gandharva called Krishanu protecting the Soma and shooting people who try to bring it. But after Gayatri safely brought it back, we see another very smart Gandharva called Vishwavasu who tried to come and steal it back. And one important feature which we see in this later stage, not seen so much in the Taittiriya and Kataka Samhitas, but in the Tandya Mahabrahmana and Aitareya Brahmana, is that this act of bringing Soma was not because of a competition of Kadru and Suparni, but because the Devas wanted Soma and they requested the Chandases, the meters, to go and get Soma for them. And these Chandamsi, meters, converted into Suparnas or beautiful winged birds and went to bring back the Amrita. What we can notice, which is a significant point in the development of this story, is by the time of the later Samhitas and Aranyakas, we also see a few more detail in that the Somalata now has got converted into a branch of the Parna tree. And the Parna refers to the Palasha, botanically known as Butea monosperma or Butea frondosa, known in Kannada as Muttuga. Now, this is one of the most beautiful trees seen throughout the subcontinent of India. In all our forests, it has glossy leaves, it has a bright red flower curved like a parrot's beak, and those flowers when boiled in water can be used to dye a sannyasin's robe. And this is one of the most handsome trees seen in the subcontinent. It is our misfortune that, like in every other aspect of our life and culture, we fill our roads with exotic trees like gulmohar and something else which don't sustain birds, don't sustain butterflies, don't sustain monkeys and squirrels, instead of growing beautiful plants like the Palasha. I really exhort ISKCON people and other residents of Bangalore, plant a Palasha tree outside your house and plant it in your compounds. Anyway, so one element which we mention here is that when the in this part of the story, in the Taittiriya and Kataka Samhitas, when Krishanu shot the bird, clearly this Krishanu was not as talented an archer as Krishanu of the Rigveda. So when he shot, he did not manage to hit the Chandases. He hit the Soma creeper. And having hit the Soma creeper, a leaf of the creeper fell off. And the leaf which fell on the ground got converted to several things. And we have a description of what happened. So different parts of the Soma creeper which fell down, the leaves got converted to the Parna or the Palasha plant. The filaments or the stamens of the flower got converted to Putika, which is another plant called Bacella cordifolia, which is usually found in the upper reaches. It is found in the Himalayas and higher altitudes. The other parts like the the bark and sap which fell got converted into the Arjuna and Prabhota plants. And one interesting point to note here is that we can already see a transition from a stage where these verses were narratives to a stage where these verses are part of ritual, because it is clearly mentioned that all of Parna, Putika, Arjuna and Prapotha are substitutes for Soma. Also, if one uses the Parna, that is Palasha sticks, as idma, as sacrificial fuel, and if one uses the Parna twig to make the juhu, the sacrificial spoon or the ladle used to give the offerings, it is equivalent to a Somayaga. So it is clear but that by the time that these texts were being put down and codified, they were having difficulty to get the Soma creeper and they were already thinking of alternatives. And the interesting point here is the reversal in that Vishwavasu tries and steals back the creeper. So those, we have heard the famous maxim from the Roman lawgiver Draco, where he says, who will guard the guards? So if the guards themselves are corrupt, then who will keep an eye on them? Similarly, if the Gandharvas who are meant to protect the Soma themselves are coming to steal it, then what do we do? We see an interesting story here. The Gandharva, when he comes to steal the Soma away again from the Devas, the Devas try and make a negotiation with him. And they tell the Gandharva who comes that you don't take the Soma, instead we'll give you Vak, the goddess of speech. And then they give Vak and this Gandharva is ready to take her away. But Vak is not very happy and she is not very keen on going with him. And then we see that the Gandharvas and Vak, the Gandharvas and the Devas are vying with each other to retain Vak with themselves and to attract Vak to themselves. And the Gandharvas is very strange here because normally they are associated with music. The Gandharvas in this stage, they recited the Vedas, whereas the Devas sang the Vedas to the accompaniment of the Veena. And as a result, Vak chose to stay with them. And this has been mentioned by the commentators like Sayanacharya. He says, to this day we can see that women are very much attracted by these musicians and instrument players. And he says, Natavita Gayakaha. And to this day women are attracted by Natavita Gayakaha. The further stage we can see of this story is in the Suparnakhyana and the Mahabharata. The Suparnakhyana is a strange text because its language seems slightly ancient and it is difficult to date it. It is hard to know whether the Mahabharata borrowed elements from the Suparnakhyana or the Suparnakhyana took elements from the Mahabharata. Nonetheless, this is the story this is the stage of the story where for the first time we see the character Suparni being referred to as Vinata. And we see that Kadru's sons are being mentioned as snakes for the first time over here. And we can also see the story occurs in the Mahabharata in the Adi Parvan, in the Astika Sabparvan. And we see that both in the Mahabharata and the Jaiminiya Brahmana, the thing that the snakes are asking for is no longer Soma but Amrita. Now, Amrita is something that is, the notion of Amrita is something that has appeared in a later stage. The Amrita, even while mentioned in the Vedic Samhita, normally does not refer to Soma. It refers to other things. It is used as an abstract noun for Amritatva rather than for a material object. So this is the Mahabharata stage of the story. There are many more layers to what happens in the Mahabharata because we can see a recapitulation or a reformulation of this story of the Amrita Harana or the Soma Harana in the form of the story of Janamejaya Sarpasatra, or even in the form of the story of the rivalry of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. I will elaborate on this if you have little more time. I will just go ahead otherwise. In the Ramayana, there is somewhat sparse mention of this Amritapaharana episode. It happens when Ravana goes to see Maricha, who is doing tapas in the Dandakaranya. When he goes there, on the bank of the ocean, he sees this huge banyan tree. And that banyan tree in those days even had a name. It is remarkable how we find that in the Sanskrit text, both in the classical text, in the Itihasas and so on, that people kept names for all sorts of things. A pet deer had a name, a weapon had a name, a tree had a name, a garden had a name. And it is remarkable that now maybe even our neighbors don't have a name. We refer to him as that fellow. And in the Ramayana, we see that Ravana sees this giant Nyagrodha tree called Subhadra. And he asks Maricha, what is this tree? And then Maricha narrates the story. This is the classical story as we see it in the Mahabharata of the rivalry between Vinata, the mother of Garuda and Aruna, and Kadru, the mother of the snakes, both of who were wives of Kashyapa. How Kadru played a trick and managed to somehow fool Vinata into believing that the tail of the Uchaishrava's horse was black while it was actually white, as the slavery of Vinata that resulted from it. As a result of that, Garuda having to go and get the Amrita and so on. This whole story is narrated in the Ramayana very concisely in a short fashion. But let us look at the two other occurrences of Garuda in the Ramayana. There are only two other instances. Can anyone think where else does Garuda come in the Ramayana? Yuddhakanda, very good. That is one episode where Indrajit hits Rama and Lakshmana with the Nagabanas, and they are bound up by the Nagapashas. Then Garuda comes and he relieves them of the Nagapasha Banda. The other is an obscure reference. When the Gangavatarana story is being narrated by Vishwamitra to Rama and Lakshmana as they are going to Mithila, what Vedanta Deshika describes as Kushika Suta Kathita Nava Vivida Katha. When Kaushika, that is Vishwamitra, was taking them, he narrated the story of Gangavatarana because it was after all the story of their ancestor and their ancestors' great deed about how Bhagirath brought down Ganga. And he says how Garuda, who was the maternal uncle of Amshuman, he was a cousin of Keshini and Suruchi. He came when the brothers of Asamanjas, the Sagaras, the thousands of Sagaras were all burnt. He came and he gave Amshuman advice saying that what you do is you go and get Ganga from the heaven, make sure that the Gangetic waters will go over their remnants, and that will lead to their liberation. And this point is very interesting because we can see Garuda as a supervisor of funerary activities for the first time here, something that is carried forward in a very big way in the Garuda Purana. And I don't think this connection has been made before. One reason which could be for Garuda's figuring not very prominently in the Ramayana, this is again my surmise and somebody could correct me if I'm wrong, is that most of the feats which we normally associate with Garuda are taken over by Hanuman in the Ramayana. So this act of going and bringing Amrita or going and bringing the Somalata, Hanuman recapitulates that by going and bringing the Sanjeevana. This act of flying up high in the sky to get an inaccessible thing like the Soma, Hanuman replicates that by going and reaching for the sun soon after he was born. The story of how Garuda, as soon as he was born, rose to his full height and was an able being is repeated in the story of Hanuman, who did not stay an infant for long. Very soon he grew up into a fully able-bodied young person. So we can see that Hanuman being represented as the paragon of speed and valor and flight. All of these are the features of Garuda which have been kind of superposed on Hanuman over here. So if we look at the various stages of the story, we can see that the earliest Rigvedic account is one of Somaharana, and it refers to how Soma was an important aspect for the Devas. For them, getting their Havirbhaga was a validation of their Devatva. In the later stage, we can see that the same story is getting converted into an act of ritual, where it is important to perform the Soma Yaga, and if you can't find the Soma itself, to find substitutes for the Soma. In the later stage, it becomes a story of sibling rivalry, and clearly the Kadru Vinata rivalry is a manifestation of the deep anthropological fear of light and dark, the fear of darkness, and the polarity of sky and earth, and the polarity of darkness and light is manifest in the form of the story of Kadru and Vinata. Now, what we can see is that very small elements of these stories and vestiges of these stories are carried forward in unexpected ways in far separated places. For example, in the Mahabharata and the later, what I call the standard version of the Garuda story, the later version which we see replicated in many places, there is this episode of how Garuda was very hungry and he asks his mother, "I'm really hungry, what do I do?" And she directs him to go and eat all the Nishadas, who are the bandits or the thieves or whole communities of people who are outside the Vedic tradition. And she also warns him not to eat the pious and not to eat the divine. And he goes and eats the Nishadas. Unfortunately, Garuda is still hungry. And then he goes and meets his father, Kashyapa, and he asks his father, "Whom shall I eat?" And his father tells him something out of which all of us can draw a lesson. And what Kashyapa tells him is, you go to this Ramaniyaka island, and over there is this giant tortoise and there is this giant elephant, and they are constantly fighting. And since they are doing nothing else but fighting, you can resolve their fight by swallowing them. And Garuda is very surprised and he asks, "What is this? Why are the two of them like that?" And Kashyapa gives us all a lesson actually by telling Garuda that, you see, actually one of them was a rishi, the other was his brother who was also participating in religious activities. And they were not happy having just got their father's inheritance and sharing it amongst the two of themselves. One of them kept insisting to the other that, "Let us split up property, you go your way, I go mine." As a result, one of them cursed the other and said, "You're constantly troubling me like this, like an elephant which is in rut, get converted to an elephant." This one got angry and said, "You're constantly postponing things like a doddering tortoise, you get converted to a tortoise." And so they got converted into this pair of giant tortoise and elephant called Vishwavasu and Supratika, who were destined to constantly fight for the rest of their lives. And I think there are some very deep telling lessons given to us through the mouth of Kashyapa, through the ears of Garuda over here. And what is interesting is that the name of that tortoise is Vishwavasu. And this Vishwavasu is a vestige of the Gandharva Vishwavasu who shot at that Shena in the Rigveda when the Shena went to pick up the Somalata. Another very interesting, much more recent 15th century repetition of this which we can see is that, as I was saying, in the Kathaka Samhita, the name of the Gandharva who shot at people who came, who was the protector, was Krishanu, and the name of the Gandharva who came and tried to steal the Amrita back was Vishwavasu. And we see these names recapitulated in Venkatadhwari's Vishwagunadarsha Champu, where the name of these two yakshas were going all around India, one of them constantly criticizing everything that he sees, one of them constantly praising everything that he sees, is Vishwavasu and Krishanu. So in a remarkable way, we see that vestiges of these ideas continue to live, continue to get recycled, and if not in the form of the same stories, they get incorporated in a very seamless, very natural fashion into other stories. Another layer of the repetition of the story which we can see is in the Mahabharata. The narration of the story happens in the Astika Parva, where Astika has come to deliver a lesson to Janamejaya, telling him, "You don't go for this kind of a vendetta. Don't take revenge against a whole tribe of people, against a whole race of people. Have you not learned any lessons from your ancestors?" And Janamejaya says, "Tell me, who are those ancestors? What did they do?" So he tells him the stories of all their atrocities, so that Janamejaya can choose to either do similar atrocities or keep away from such atrocities. And one story which he narrates then is the story of the story of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, who are his ancestors. And here we can see very interesting things, because this is not the first Sarpasatra that was conducted, which is narrated in the Mahabharata. There have been several Sarpasatras which have been conducted before. And the first Sarpasatra was not conducted by somebody who hated snakes or somebody who wanted a revenge on snakes. Can you imagine who conducted the first Sarpasatra? The first, the first Sarpasatra was conducted by Sarpas themselves. And their purpose for conducting this was not killing their kin, their kith and kin. Their purpose of conducting a yajna, a sartra conducted by the Sarpas, was so that they could get invincibility, so that they could get potent powers, so that they could get cold-bloodedness or some such feature. And we see that the early names of the Sarpas who indulged in the Satras mentioned in the Brahmanas and in the Samhitas are all very familiar names. We find names like Airavata, we find names like Yuyutsu, we find a name like even Dhritarashtra. Dhritarashtra is seen very often. So Dhritarashtra having been the name of a Naga in the past who conducted the Sarpasatra. And we also know that it is said by some that Dhritarashtra had a large number of children born out of Naga parentage. And therefore this motif of the Nagas in the Mahabharata is a very prominent motif of great anthropological value. It has to be seen through that lens. And we see other duplications in the form that the rivalry of the Pandavas and the Kauravas is similar to the rivalry of the Kadraveyas and Vinata through her son Garuda. We can also see that there are certain changes in the perception of Garuda as time changes. The name Garuda itself is a fairly novel name. The older names used were Suparna. There was an independent deity called Tarkshya, and later the identification of a folk deity who was associated with the chthonic Naga tribes called most probably Garuda or Garutman was fused with the identity of this Tarkshya and with the identity of Suparna. So what we see in the later stage is that all of these separate entities, that is the Shena who went and got the Somalata, the Suparna who was one of the Chandases going to get the Somalata, and Tarkshya who was a Vedic deity, Garuda who was probably a tribal deity, and Garutman who again is a classical deity, all of these have been merged in various layers into one entity. And the treatment of Garuda and this even though these changes have happened, we see that some of, as I said earlier, some of the vestiges remain. In what form? We see that someone as early as Sayanacharya says that Trayi Rupo Garutman, while referring to one of these Aitareya Brahmana or something. And he says that Garuda is a representation of the Veda. And what is happening here? What they mean is that the same Chandas which went before as a Shena now has become this Garuda. But this idea of Garuda being Trayi Rupa is very powerful. It has been used by Sayanacharya. It has been taken up later by the Vaishnavas, in whose theology Garuda is an important deity. We can see in a verse of Yamunacharya, one of the early Vishishtadvaita scholars, where he's praising Lakshmi, but incidentally he says, Kantaste Purushottamaha Bhanipati Shaya Asanam Vahanam Vedatma Vihageshwaro. He says Vihageshwara is the Vedatma. And we can find a replication of that in Vedanta Deshika's two verses on Garuda, one being the Garuda Panchashat. The verse from that I haven't brought, for one for paucity of time, two because Shankar already mentioned it in his talk. The other place that he mentions it is in the Garuda Dandaka, and there the first verse of the Garuda Dandaka itself goes this way. Namah Pannaganadhaya Vaikuntha Vashavartine Shruti Sindhu Sudhotpata Mandarayo Garutmati. I salute Garutman, who is like the mantha, the churn for extracting the essence or the amrita out of the ocean of the Shrutis, the ocean of the Vedas. So this notion of Garuda or Garutman being equated with not just the meters but with the content of the Veda has happened in the later stage, and we can see this being reinforced in texts like the Satvata Samhita of the Pancharatra, which is a Vaishnava Agama. And we can also see that Garuda has continued in the popular imagination as the Vahana of Vishnu, as the flag Lanchana of Vishnu. We see this very interesting episode in the Mahabharata version of the story where Vishnu is seeing from a distance when Garuda is carrying the Amrita for his cousins, and he is very impressed that this Garuda went through all this effort. He went to heaven and there he fought with two snakes. He went through a wheel of steel and he managed to get this Amrita, and he is going to give it to those cousins of his who don't deserve it, those snakes. It did not occur to him to even drink a drop of that Amrita himself. He's such a sincere person. So what he does is he calls Garuda and he tells him, okay, come on, you are very sincere, I'm impressed with you. You ask me a boon. And Garuda is he was just born a few minutes ago. He doesn't know anything about courtesy and formality. He says, oh, you are giving me a boon. I'll also give you a boon. You ask me what you want. And Narayana is quite amused. And then Garuda asks him, Vishnu says, no, you ask me first. So Garuda asks him, despite not having this Amrita, may I never suffer from hunger and thirst and fatigue. And Vishnu tells him, you be my Lanchana, you come and sit in my flagstaff. And so we see that Garuda eventually is represented as the Vahana of Vishnu as well as the flag mark of Vishnu. So we see later mentions of Garuda in Natakas like the Nagananda Nataka, where he still continues to be seen as a rival of the Nagas. Now, there are tribes who worship the Nagas, and for these the tribal's relationship with the deity that they worship is in some ways similar and in some ways dissimilar to the other classic Brahmanical and Vedic traditions of a deity that they worship, because they both love these gods and fear these gods. So the tribes that worship the snakes are in constant fear of being bitten by a snake or a snake coming and biting a family member, but they also respect and adore these snakes. They have that kind of a fraught, complicated relationship, and we often see that the same people who worship the snake also worship the Garuda. The Garuda is also represented in the Kalpashastra in the form of the Shenachiti, which is very important for the Soma ritual. But coming back to the story, the same people who worship the snake also worship its rival Garuda. If you notice that the popular celebration of Naga Panchami in many people's houses is known as Garuda Panchami, and they propitiate Garuda at the same time. And because these people, they worship the snakes, they respect them, they love them, they live along with them, but they also know what it means to be bitten by a snake. So they are constantly training themselves in the Vidyas to counteract the poison, and those Vidyas have traditionally been known as the Garuda Vidya, the Garuda Vidya, the Vishahari Vidya, and those Vidyas have been associated with Garuda, and often they even use various kinds of herbs or stones that are called Garuda Mani, and there are many references to these kinds of jewels in literature. And I have been told that I have 5 minutes left. I have covered most of the points that I wanted to. Maybe we could have some discussion if there are any points that others would like to raise. Palasha. Palasha. So there are many plants which in the Indian references to botanical references, many plants which are said to have been born either when Garuda was carrying the soma and a leaf of it fell down, or when Garuda was carrying the Amrita Kalasha and a few drops of it fell down. A few plants are said to have been sanctified by this. So Palasha is one such plant. It is said that a drop of Amrita, while Garuda was carrying it in great haste, a drop of Amrita fell down, and the plant which emerged was Palasha. Two other such plants which are said to have been sanctified by Amrita are the Darbha plant. Because when Garuda brought, that is a nice story, when Garuda brought the Amrita and he decided that he will bring it for the snakes but not let the snakes drink it, he plays a small trick on his cousins. He tells them, see, I have brought and kept this. This is an important, momentous event in all your lives. You are all snakes, reptiles constantly crawling on your stomachs. You are all so filthy. You first go bathe and come, then you drink this. It's an important event in your life. They say, yes, let us all go bathe. Well, meanwhile, when they have gone to bathe, like Vishwavasu came to steal the Amrita in the Rigvedic account, Indra came and stole back this Amrita. But what happened was it had been kept on a bed of kusha grass, and the snakes came back. They said, yo, what has happened? Amrita seems to have evaporated. Let us at least lick this kusha grass. Maybe there is some Amrita fallen over there. And they say that the snakes who till then had a normal tongue like us licked the kusha grass, which is very sharp, and their tongues got split and they became the Dvijihvas. But that story aside, the Palasha is of great ritual importance. It is impossible to conduct any yajna yaga without using idma of Palasha. Nowadays, people, for part of their starting the fire, they go and buy firewood from the same place where you buy firewood for your bathroom stove. But what is used as idma, there are only 5 species of trees which are allowed, and Palasha is called the most shrestha amongst those. The leaves of Palasha are frequently sown and used for food as leaf plates. If you break the branch of the Palasha, it releases a niryasa or a sap which is red in color, which has lots of medicinal properties enumerated in the Ayurveda Shastras.
As basic data for arriving at reasonable conclusions. All these texts contain all these texts contain, as we know, imaginations, fancies, and all these things. So how can this data be used for a research on a topic like this for arriving at reasonable conclusion?
Thank you for your question. I think both of them are in a clarificatory fashion. Yeah, the question that was asked, the first question that was asked was, it appears like I am making a conflation of Somarasa with Amrita. It seems like I am saying that both of these are the same thing. How did I arrive at this conclusion? The second question is that, unlike the Veda, to which we give a different epistemic validity, if we look at the Kavyas and the Itihasas, we know that they have been handled by many people over time, and it is possible that a lot of their content emerges from the poet's imagination. So can we come to any reasonable conclusions, and will our research be as valid as that in other technical methods? Is that right? So let me respond very quickly to both of those. The answer to the first question is, actually the general answer is, the idea here is not to prove the right or the wrong. It is to look at the evolution of the story. If there is a legend, and at some stage it may not have been legend, it may have been an historical event, but the same idea, we see that there is an evolution of the idea. The idea undergoes various avatars, and that idea is manifested in various ways. The idea gets broken up into smaller units, which later manifest somewhere else. That is all that I have tried to do. I have not, none of the things that I have spoken today are in the realm of reality in the way that a physicist or a biologist would talk about it. So it is looking at the ideas and how people have construed those ideas. No, this is not my area of research. The other thing is the conflation of Somalata and Amrita. I am not saying that Somalata is Amrita or Somarasa became Amrita. What happens is, if we look at the various stages of this story, the various times that the same episode of Somaharanam is mentioned, in the later text, which is mostly the post-Itihasa text, we find that the reference is less frequently to Soma and more frequently to Amrita. That is all that I said.
The title of the presentation, but I would like to get the point, how do you correlate that, and how do you justify that kind of a comparison?
Oh, I am feeling quite bad that I didn't make it clear through the talk. I'll try and respond anyway. So since we see that the earliest stage of the story is where there was a Deva, either Vamadeva or Indra, who took the form of a bird. And in the later stages, we see that it was a meter, and it was a Vedic meter no less, that took the form of a bird. And we see in the much later stage, far removed from those times, maybe a few millennia far removed from those times, we see this bird which is seen as the Vahana of Mahavishnu, and that bird is being identified with the corpus of the Veda, which is the word. And that is the reason for the choice of the title. I hope I have clarified.
Please enlighten us regarding the Gandharvas and Devas. You have mentioned regarding the three-layered world. Where does they reside? How we can understand what is their function, and how best we can going to achieve from them.
Thank you for your question, sir. I think to understand profound ideas like the Gandharvas and the Devas and the three-layered world, how we can achieve that world, how we can get the address of that world, how we can go there, we cannot do it in the short kind of superficial research that I do. What it requires is a deep engagement both with the practice and the text of the Vedas, and that has to emerge from a personal relationship with the Veda and through some form of enlightenment. It cannot come merely through a textual reading of the Veda, which is all I have done. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Mr. High Speed Naresh Kirti. Mr. Naresh Kirti mentioned one point, citing Sayana, that women are fond of those who sing and can play on instruments. Naresh Kirti himself is very good at music. So Mr. Naresh Kirti is a very simple but a very complex man. So his knowledge of various fields is simply amazing. Let me tell you very clearly, this young boy has a very bright future and is a man to watch. The various fields he has mastered, but he won't admit, are cognitive science, biology, music, mathematics, linguistics, and I have seen him compose verses in Avadhana programs. While Shatavadhani Ganesh is composing a verse, the challenge is posed to him. Sitting in the audience, he has himself composed verses and come up within the same duration. He has been able to compose verse in the audience. I have sit by his side and I have seen him do that. He studied.
Point, when he was in 10th standard, he had composed one in the meter Sharda Bhujanga Prayama Stotra.
He has also, thank you for the information, Mr. Suresh. He has also composed many verses in Sanskrit. He also has studied anthropology, deeply interested in archaeology and Sanskrit. And here we see another dimension of his keen interest in narratology. And see, it's a regular discipline in which how tales are retold, so reformulated. So this also, his penetration is really amazing. So how he is able to, see, he is not a person from the basic field of Sanskrit, and few Sanskritists have been able to do the kind of work he has been able to do. So he is able to see through the story, so which is undergoing some kinds of metamorphosis from the Vedic times right up to the Puranic times, and brings out various layers. I have seen many Sanskrit people using the word wrongly as Vinuta. Her name is Vinata, hence her son's name is Vainateya, standing for Garuda. So very careful, very alert. Those who come to speak at Niyas, so keep a watch over him. His questions will be the hardest ones to answer. He seems to know almost every field, but utterly unassuming and simple. And whenever I have visited Niyas, I always find him playing badminton and table tennis or whatever, and I wonder when he has the time to study. But you know what he is. We are extremely thankful to Mr. Naresh Kirti. May his Kirti spread far and wide.